Okay, guys, we're back with another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest. I'm Seth from the Learning Solo podcast, and this video we're going to be talking about my official prediction for Chris Eubank Jr. v Conor Benn, the fight that's happening this Saturday. Um, at middleweight at £160, they're fighting at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. It's going to be one hell of a fight, in my opinion. It's going to be a super hard one to predict, to be honest. You know, if you know my videos, you know that I'm often one to sit on the fence rather, but I'm going to give my official prediction. I'm going to give a decisive prediction in this video as well. I'm going to talk about how I think the fight's going to go. I'm going to talk about who I think is going to win and who my money's on. So we'll kick it off with Chris Eubank Jr. Of course, Chris Eubank Jr., the bigger guy. He's won world titles at middleweight and super middleweight. Not like proper world titles, just like IBO world titles, which, you know, they're not one of the big four, so count them however you want. But he has fought more high-level guys than Conor Benn. Yes, he's lost to high-level guys. He lost to George Groves and lost to Billy Joe Saunders. He did get stopped by Liam Smith, but did avenge that loss. But again, the fact that he's even been in there with high-level guys does sort of give him the edge, in my opinion. Of course, he beat James DeGale. James DeGale was completely robbed by that point, but still a big win for Chris Eubank Jr. Whereas you look at someone like Conor Benn's resume, his only half-decent wins are against guys who are welterweights and past their prime as well. Similar to the way James DeGale was past his prime. The guys, Conor Benn's biggest wins are against guys who are past their primes, your Chris Algieri's and Chris Van Heerden. Guys that are washed. Guys that were, even at their peak, were fringe world level guys. And they're past their peak now, right? Conor Benn, to be fair to him, did get those guys out of there. At welterweight, he proved to be quite a decent puncher. He's moved up to 154, not been as good of a puncher, not been as effective, and now he's going to move up again against Chris Eubank Jr. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. is 100% the best guy Conor Benn has fought. And to be fair, in my opinion, I think Conor Benn is probably the most ferocious puncher that Chris Eubank has fought. Well, I think punch for punch, he doesn't hit. Punch for punch, he probably hits harder than George Groves, Billy Joe Saunders. Liam Smith stopped him. And I think Conor Benn hits harder than Liam Smith. And Liam Smith stopped him, right? That being said, if we're looking at the pure boxing ability, you've got to give the edge to Chris Eubank. The power advantage and speed at this point goes to Conor Benn, but the boxing IQ probably goes to Chris Eubank Jr. Even then, Chris Eubank Jr.'s boxing IQ has never really been his strength. If we're looking back at his fights, particularly in his losses, his boxing IQ has never been a strength. But you've got a guy like Conor Benn whose boxing IQ is even lower than Chris Eubank's. It's a bit of a tricky one. But I say all of that to say, I actually think Chris Eubank Jr. should win this fight. He's the bigger guy. He's a decent boxer. Can he take Conor Benn's shots though? That's the real determining factor. I mean, it's boxing. That's always going to be the determining factor. Can you take the guy's shots? I'm not convinced that he can. A 36-year-old Chris Eubank Jr. that's been stopped by Liam Smith. I'm not 100% convinced that he can take Conor Benn's shots, but I'm more convinced that Chris Eubank Jr. can probably avoid those shots early on in the fight and then maybe tire Conor Benn out, as Conor Benn's never fought at middleweight before. Despite what Nigel Benn's saying in the press conference that Conor Benn could go 15 rounds, I do find it a bit hard to believe. Also, I think we're potentially underestimating Chris Eubank Jr.'s power as well. Chris Eubank Jr.'s stopped a lot of guys. He stopped Liam Smith as well. He stopped a lot of guys at middleweight and super middleweight. He's got 25 knockouts on his record. Chris Eubank Jr.'s got more knockouts than Conor Benn has fights. Right? And Chris Eubank Jr.'s been knocking out, like I said, middleweights and super middleweights. Where Conor Benn couldn't even knock out guys at junior middleweight or super welterweight. So, my opinion, it's got to go towards a Chris Eubank Jr. win. I think, I don't know, if we see the old Chris Eubank Jr. that isn't afraid to take some shots and is willing to walk his guy down, put him against the ropes. If he's willing to put Conor Benn against the ropes, then I think Conor Benn's really going to struggle in this fight. Right? Because to be fair to Conor Benn, he has got some good head movement, but he's not defensively slick enough to avoid the sort of onslaught that a young Chris Eubank Jr. would be putting on a guy. Whereas if we see the sort of newer version of Chris Eubank, where he's trying to be a bit more of a boxer than a puncher, and he's trying to use his jab a bit more, that's not his strength. That's never been his strength, right? But if he doesn't play to his strengths, and like I said, try and walk Conor Benn down and tries to box how he's boxing now, it gives Conor Benn more of a chance. But my money's on Chris Eubank Jr. As soon as the fight got announced and confirmed and the odds were released, I put my money on Chris Eubank Jr. because he's the bigger guy. He's so much bigger than him. A guy who's won a world title at 168 against a guy who's never won anything at welterweight in a world level capacity, right? And at least Chris Eubank Jr., I'm sure he was a British champion at some point as well. Conor Benn wasn't even a British champion. He sort of just skipped that, but he had fought some guys that had boxed at world level, like I said before, Chris Algieri, Chris Van Heerden, but these guys were washed by the time they fought Conor Benn. It's going to be an interesting fight. It's going to be a super interesting fight. I think, like I said, I'm giving the edge to Chris Eubank Jr. It's who I've got my money on. The bigger guy, been in there with high-level guys before, been under the big lights before, lost under the big lights as well, so he knows the feeling. Lost and won under the big lights, Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. I've got to give the edge to Chris Eubank Jr. And that's who my money's on. But yeah, another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest in the bag. Who do you think is going to win this fight? Because this is an interesting fight for me. Styles make matches, but Chris Eubank Jr. is the far bigger guy. So yeah, who do you think is going to win this fight? Another episode of the Seth Solo Side Quest in the bag, and I'm out. Peace.